Well, here are your national headlines this morning. President Trump says he's ending all trade negotiations with Canada. The president said on social media Thursday night he's taking that action because of Canadian ads.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is telling Southeast Asian leaders that Canada values a system that's based on rules while respecting trade agreements and the rule of law. This after President Trump announced he's increasing the tariff on Canada by 10% in response to the anti-tariff ad featuring the voice of former President Ronald Reagan. Harry Coro tells us more.
Donald Trump has abruptly halted every trade negotiation with Canada, and the reason behind it has nothing to do with complex policies or diplomatic breakdowns. It all began with a single political ad from Ontario's government, a bold piece that dared to challenge Trump's tariffs by echoing the words of Ronald Reagan himself. The message was clear: free trade used to be a cornerstone of American pride, long before Trump started reshaping that legacy to fit his narrative. Now he's denying that Reagan ever opposed tariffs, twisting history to protect his image after being publicly embarrassed. On the other side, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney isn't backing down. His response, calm yet cutting, has turned a simple ad into a global statement about truth, pride, and power. How did a 30-second commercial ignite a full-blown political storm? And what does this clash reveal about the fragile state of North American diplomacy? The announcement hit like a shockwave across Washington and Ottawa. US President Donald Trump had abruptly ordered an end to all trade negotiations with Canada. No warnings, no behind-the-scenes diplomacy, just an early morning outburst on social media and a directive that brought months of progress to a halt. The reason, however, wasn't some complex policy dispute or a last-minute trade disagreement. It all came down to a single ad, a political message paid for by Ontario's government that aired across major American networks and featured the unmistakable voice of Ronald Reagan. The ad played a clip from a 1987 radio address where Reagan warned Americans that tariffs were a hidden tax on the consumer. For a man who built his platform on nationalist economics, Trump took that personally. He fired back online, accusing Canada of fraud, interference, and deception, claims that would soon crumble under the weight of history. The Ontario government reportedly spent $75 million on the campaign, designed to remind Americans that free trade had once been a pillar of US prosperity. It didn't criticize Trump directly. Instead, it let Reagan's words do the talking. In the clip, Reagan's calm presidential tone stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that defines modern trade politics. His message was simple: protectionism always backfires. That truth struck a nerve. Trump lashed out, insisting Reagan had been a supporter of tariffs and accusing Canada of lying about his legacy. But anyone could check the record. The speech still exists in full. Reagan's warning was clear and undeniable, and with that, Trump's claim fell apart. He wasn't defending an old American ideal, he was rewriting it. The ad didn't embarrass him through speculation or opinion. It did something far worse for his image. It confronted him with his own side's history. Within hours, Trump's anger grew. He claimed that Canada was trying to manipulate a pending Supreme Court decision related to his tariffs. He posted multiple times, each one filled with errors and contradictions. He blamed Canada for the ad, though it came from Ontario's provincial government. He called it fake, despite the fact that Reagan's own voice was featured word for word. It was a storm of misinformation meant to drown out the one thing Trump couldn't control: the truth. The tape spoke for itself, and it painted a picture that contradicted his entire trade philosophy. To understand why this single ad caused such an explosive reaction, it's important to look at what had been brewing behind the scenes. Trump had been struggling for months to regain leverage over Canada in trade negotiations. His tariffs on steel and aluminum had hurt US manufacturers and alienated farmers. Canadian officials had refused to fold under pressure, continuing talks with quiet confidence. Every time Trump tried to escalate, Canada pushed back with facts and diplomacy. That dynamic infuriated him. So when the Ontario ad went public, it wasn't only about economics, it was about pride. Trump felt mocked, undermined, and cornered by an ally he could no longer intimidate. Trump's decision to end trade talks wasn't a strategic move, it was an emotional one. His administration spun it as a matter of principle, but it was clear that his ego had taken the lead. Ontario's ad didn't challenge US sovereignty. It highlighted economic truths that many Americans already understood but were reluctant to say aloud. Tariffs had become a hidden tax on American families, raising prices and straining businesses on both sides of the border. Instead of addressing those consequences, Trump framed the ad as an attack on his leadership. In reality, it was his own insecurities that pushed him to cut off negotiations. Reporters pressed White House officials for an explanation. Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, tried to tone down the controversy. Speaking to journalists outside the White House, he claimed that Trump's frustration had been building for some time. According to Hassett, the president believed Canada had been difficult during the negotiations and that this decision wasn't entirely about the ad. He pointed to trade deals the US had managed to secure elsewhere as proof of progress. But his explanation only deepened the sense that Trump's move was impulsive. If talks had been progressing in certain areas, why blow everything up over a provincial commercial? The answer again circled back to pride. While the White House scrambled to justify the decision, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a response that caught global attention. Speaking at a press event later that day, Carney didn't mention Trump's name once. Instead, he spoke about history. The 1980s were a different time, he said. US trade policy used to reflect shared prosperity. It was a short statement, but it carried tremendous weight. Every diplomat in the room knew what he meant. Reagan's America had built partnerships. Trump's America was tearing them apart. Without any direct confrontation, Carney had turned Reagan's legacy into a mirror that reflected Trump's contradictions. Carney's tone remained calm, but his message was clear. Canada would not be drawn into political theatre. The country had spent decades strengthening its economic independence, and it no longer relied on the goodwill of a volatile neighbour. He emphasised that Canada recognised how much US trade policy had changed over the decades. The shift from cooperation to confrontation had forced Canada to adapt, and it had done so effectively. His comments highlighted a new reality. The United States had tariffs in place against nearly every major trading partner, leaving allies wary and cautious. Carney explained that despite these tensions, Canadian and American officials had been making progress in certain sectors like steel, aluminum, and energy. Behind closed doors, talks had been technical and focused on solutions rather than rhetoric. That work, he implied, had been undone overnight by Trump's decision. Yet his tone carried no bitterness, only quiet confidence. Canada would continue to seek fair trade wherever possible, but it would not compromise its principles to satisfy political theatrics. Under Carney's leadership, Canada had expanded its global reach. Trade with Europe had grown stronger, partnerships with India and Japan were flourishing, and economic ties with China were deepening. This diversification wasn't accidental. It was a calculated move to ensure that Canada's future wouldn't be dictated by a single, unpredictable partner. So, while Trump might believe ending negotiations gave him leverage, in reality, it weakened his position. Canada no longer depended on US approval to define its economic direction. As the dust settled, Trump's decision began to look less like an act of power and more like a retreat. His administration tried to frame it as decisive leadership, but the optics told a different story. Walking away from an ally in the middle of negotiations revealed frustration, not control. It showed that the White House had run out of arguments strong enough to counter the truth at the heart of that Ontario ad. For all the talk about tariffs making America stronger, the policy had backfired, and the president knew it. In political circles, analysts called Trump's move symbolic, a show of defiance aimed at his supporters rather than a calculated policy choice. But symbolism has consequences. Ending talks with Canada sent a chilling message to investors and businesses across the continent. It raised questions about reliability, stability, and trust. And it gave Canada the moral upper hand, allowing Carney to frame the episode as proof that integrity and patience win where aggression fails. Over time, the narrative began to shift. What started as an argument over a single ad became a reflection of a much larger divide between two visions of leadership. On one side, Trump's bluster driven by image and reaction. On the other, Carney's quiet firmness, grounded in history and fact. One sought headlines, the other earned respect. And as Reagan's voice continued to echo across American airwaves, many were reminded of what genuine conservative economics once meant: partnership, not punishment. Trump may have been able to silence trade negotiations, but he couldn't silence Reagan's words. The truth remained on record for anyone willing to listen. In trying to rewrite history, Trump ended up exposing how fragile his own political foundation had become. The Ontario ad didn't only challenge his policies, it revealed how deeply his version of nationalism had drifted from the values it claimed to protect. As the story unfolded, it became clear that this was more than a diplomatic dispute. It was a defining moment in North American politics. One leader wielded anger as a weapon, the other wielded history as a shield. And while Trump's circle scrambled to regain control of the narrative, Carney stood unshaken, letting time and truth do their work. Trump may have walked away from the table, but Canada hasn't. Carney's steady, fact-based leadership continues to prove that real strength isn't found in louder words or public threats. It's found in standing tall when others falter. And as Trump's falsehoods collapse under the weight of real history, Canada's position only grows stronger. Moreover, in other news, Prime Minister Mark Carney landed in Malaysia late Saturday, hoping to strengthen Canada's trade ties with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. His arrival drew attention from across the Pacific, not just for the business prospects it promised, but because of the uncertainty hanging over Canada's relationship with its largest trading partner. The question echoing through the corridors of Kuala Lumpur's summit was whether Carney would cross paths with US President Donald Trump, who was expected to arrive the following day. Tensions between Washington and Ottawa had erupted once again after Trump abruptly cancelled ongoing trade discussions with Canada. The move came in response to a political ad from Ontario that aired in the United States as mentioned above, featuring clips of former President Ronald Reagan praising free trade and condemning tariffs. Trump furiously denounced the ad as fake, declaring that all negotiations with Canada were terminated effective immediately. The statement sent shockwaves through both governments and left markets on edge. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, seeking to calm the storm, announced that the ad would be suspended by Monday, hoping it might pave the way for talks to resume. Yet inside Carney's circle, there was no clear sign that Washington planned to reopen discussions anytime soon. Before boarding his flight to Kuala Lumpur, Carney gave a reserved response to Trump's outrage. He emphasized that Canada's focus had been on advancing cooperation in key industries like steel, aluminum, and energy. He stated that his government remained ready to continue those talks once the United States was willing to re-engage, noting that economic progress between the two nations benefits workers and families on both sides of the border. Whether Carney would have the chance to convey that message directly to Trump in Malaysia remained uncertain. For his part, Trump told reporters he had no intention of meeting with the Canadian leader, dismissing the Reagan ad as possibly AI-generated. Even after learning that Ontario planned to pull the commercial, Trump accused Canada of dirty playing, warning that he could respond in kind. His remarks only deepened the rift and added another layer of unpredictability to an already fragile relationship. A senior Canadian official travelling with the Prime Minister revealed that the Malaysian trip was primarily focused on bilateral discussions with key ASEAN members, but that the goal was to finalise the long-awaited Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which officials hoped could be signed the following year. According to the delegation, Southeast Asia represented a vital opportunity for Canada at a time when traditional trade partnerships were under strain. Many of these nations are among the fastest-growing economies in the world, and Canada aimed to expand market access for its exporters while reinforcing its reputation as a reliable global partner. Carney has repeatedly spoken about diversifying Canada's trade portfolio and reducing its dependence on the American market. Strengthening ties with emerging regions like Southeast Asia, he argued, would create new opportunities for growth and give Canadian businesses the stability they need amid global uncertainty. Yet even as his team prepared for a new round of negotiations in Kuala Lumpur, observers back home acknowledged that progress in ASEAN would be gradual, reaching consensus among nations with vastly different levels of economic development and regulatory systems was proving far more complicated than anticipated. What do you think? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, subscribe for more, and thanks for tuning in.